It was the middle of the heroic age of Arctic exploration. Explorer Robert Scott stumbled through the endless landscape of ice and snow. He had walked 20 miles with frost-bitten toes. The temperature had now reached -40 degrees. His supplies had run out. His companion, Lawrence Oates, told him, "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time," and he stepped out into the blizzard. Welcome! Gather around the campfire and let me tell you a story. Today I'm going to be talking about the doomed Arctic expedition of Robert Falcon Scott. Robert Falcon Scott was born on June 6, 1868 in England. He was the middle child in a family of 6, to his father, John Edward, a brewer and magistrate, and his mother, Hannah Scott. His grandfather and 4 uncles were in the Army and the Navy, and the family wasted no time in shoving Robert and his brother into the armed service as well. Scott studied for only 4 years at a normal day school before being sent to what was known as a cram school, which trained students to pass a specific exam. Picture a college library during finals week, but every week is finals week here. Scott passed the naval entrance exam at age 13 and joined a training ship, the HMS Britannia, as a cadet. In 1883, when he was 18, he finished 7th in his class of 26 and graduated from the Britannia. He was stationed in South Africa and then St. Kitts, and it was there that he met Clements Markham, the secretary of the Royal Geographical Society. Markham watched a bright and energetic Scott win the morning ship race, and he eyed him as a potential recruit for the Society's expeditions. Scott quickly climbed the ranks of the Navy, becoming a sub-lieutenant in 1888 and a lieutenant in 1889. He completed a 2-year torpedo training course, and then in 1889 and 1890, Scott disappeared from naval records entirely for several months, but the reason for this has never been confirmed. In 1893, he accidentally ran his torpedo boat aground, but this was considered a mild mistake. In 1894, Scott received a message from his family. His father had sold the brewery and made poor investments, and now they were bankrupt. John Scott died 3 years later, at age 66, from heart disease, while Robert was still away with the Navy. His mother and his 2 unmarried sisters were now completely dependent on Robert and his brother, Archie. Unfortunately, right before this tragedy, Archie had traded his high-paying army job for a chance in the colonies. In 1898, the Scott family received another blow, when Archie died from typhoid fever. The fate of his surviving family members now rested entirely on Robert Scott. He needed a promotion, and fast. But promotions for officers in the Royal Navy were few and cutthroat. But opportunity found its way to Scott in an unlikely place. When he was home on leave in 1899, he once again ran into Clements Markham, now a knight and the president of the Geographical Society. Scott was ambitious, and this was his chance to be a leader, a chance to prove himself, a chance to better support his family. A few days after the 2 men ran into each other, Robert Scott showed up on Markham's doorstep and volunteered to lead the Society's Arctic expedition. This expedition was a collaboration between the British Royal Navy and the Geographical Society. A team of 50 men were collected for the journey. There was conflict within the committee overseeing the expedition about who was to lead the trip. The Geographical Society wanted the scientist in charge, but Markham backed Scott, and he won. Scott was given the rank of commander, and King Edward VII, look at my Roman numeral reading knowledge coming in handy, came to the ship the day before it left. King Edward made Scott a member of the Royal Victorian Order before the ship had even left the harbor, so there was really no pressure at all on this expedition. They ventured out on August 6, 1901. One man, Charles Bonner, died before they even reached Antarctica, as he fell from the top of the ship's mast while they waved goodbye to the shore of New Zealand, which isn't a great way to start out a trip. There was a slight problem with this team. Almost none of them had the slightest idea what the Arctic was like, or how to prepare for it. They had no training on the equipment they used. They They brought skis, but they couldn't figure out how to use them well. They brought a team of 13 dogs, but the dogs were actually too good at their jobs, and they traveled so fast that the group had to load the sleds up so that the dogs would be slowed down. The explorers planned to feed the dogs dried fish, but they did not do well on this diet, and all of the dogs died, and, gross alert, were eaten. The men had to haul the sleds themselves after that. The team also made the questionable decision to leave their tent during a blizzard, and one of them, George Vince, slipped over an icy precipice into the sea to his death, while his companions watched and barely avoided the same fate. Sorry, George. The goals of this expedition were both for scientific research and general exploration of the area. Scott and 2 other explorers, Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, ventured out towards the South Pole, and they made it within 530 miles, which sounds like a lot when I remember riding the mile in high school, but it's actually pretty close in Antarctic terms. On their return, Shackleton collapsed and had to leave the expedition early. On year 2 of the expedition, the team started to get a better handle on Antarctic living. Scott discovered the polar plateau, also known as the Antarctic Plateau, which is exactly what it sounds like, a vast stretch of ice 620 miles across, which may not have looked like much, but it was still a pretty cool, no pun intended, achievement. Shackleton would later be the first explorer to cross part of it, when he had returned to Antarctica in 1909 during the Nimrod expedition, although he would again have to turn back from actually reaching the South Pole. The Discovery expedition did collect significant biological, geographical, and zoological information, although not as much meteorological and magnetic information as hoped. When the Discovery expedition ended in 1903, their ship got stuck in ice, and it took 2 other ships and explosives to free it. But when they returned home, Scott was greeted as a hero in Britain. He gave lectures, attended fancy parties, received honors, and wrote an account of the journey titled The Voyage of the Discovery. He met with the Prince and Queen of Portugal, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, and visited King Edward at his castle in Scotland, and he returned to the Navy in a higher position. In 1909, he met accomplished sculptor and socialite Kathleen Bruce at a private high society luncheon, where I'm imagining a menu of cucumber sandwiches and tiny scones were served. The 2 clicked, but it wasn't completely smooth sailing for this Navy commander. Kathleen was also being courted by author Gilbert Cannon, but Kathleen chose Scott, and it was probably a good choice considering Cannon was having an affair with the wife of J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan. Cannon later married her, then cheated on her, divorced her, then had a mental breakdown. So yeah, Kathleen probably actually got the better deal being married to an Arctic explorer who was gone half the time in Navy service. Kathleen and Scott married in 1908 and had 1 son, Peter Markham Scott, born the next year, who was named after Clemens Markham, who had sent Scott on his expedition. Peter Scott would later go on to found the World Wildlife Fund, a conservation organization which still operates today, and which I personally held a bake sale for in high school, so I know what I'm talking about. My Halloween chocolate bark recipe is a bestseller. But during Scott's time of domestic bliss, there was trouble brewing between him and Ernest Shackleton. Scott was planning to return to Antarctica when Shackleton announced that he was planning on returning to their base and trying again to reach the South Pole. The 3rd man who had been on their first try, zoologist Edward Wilson, defended Scott's claim to the area. Scott was also angered by the publication of a map of their first journey close to the pole during the Discovery expedition that implied Scott and Shackleton commanded the trip together, although the mapmaker apologized and Scott eventually rolled it back and apologized as well, writing, "I tried to be impartial in giving credit to my companions, who one and all labored honestly and well as I have endeavored to record. I understand now, of course, that you had no personal knowledge of the wording, and I must express regret that I failed to realize your identity when I first wrote." Shackleton eventually sucked it up and agreed to stay away from their area, but he would be forced to break this promise when he couldn't find a better place to land. He was criticized by British Arctic folks at the time, although some historians also criticized Scott for being a little too territorial about it. I mean, I know it's basically a British pastime to claim stuff that doesn't really belong to them, but when they're both British? Oh boy. Something about that -40-degree crevasse-filled icy expanse of practically nothing really called out to Robert Scott. He formed a 2nd expedition to return to the Antarctic. He had been so close last time. This time, he would reach the South Pole. no matter what. In 1909, Scott heard that his frenemy, Ernest Shackleton, had just managed to miss his goal of reaching the pole on their expedition unfortunately named Nimrod. This added a little flavor of revenge to Scott's motivation sandwich, and it's one best served cold. This expedition was not for money or rank like the first had been. Scott took half pay from the Navy to be placed on leave to go. This expedition would become much more infamous than the first, and it would also be named after its transport ship, the Terra Nova, which translates to New Land. The Geographical Society hoped that the main goal of the expedition would be scientific research, but they weren't in charge this time. Robert Scott was, and his mission was clear. As he wrote, it was, quote, to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement, unquote. The sun didn't set on the British Empire, and soon not even the icy plains of Antarctica would be safe from their conquest. Markham would later recount that Scott had been, quote, bitten by the pole mania, unquote, which is not in fact an obsession with me or other Polish people. 8,000 men applied for this trip, and 65 were chosen. That's a lower acceptance rate than Harvard. 7 of them had previously been on the Discovery expedition, and 5 had gone on the Nimrod trip with Shackleton. Second in command, Lieutenant Edgar Evans abandoned his own expedition plans to merge with Scott's. The British Royal Navy supplied many of the personnel again. Army Captain Lawrence Oates, who had the incredible nickname of Titus, even though it just makes me think of the villain from Megamind, joined the expedition as well, bringing along the modern-day equivalent of over 100,000 pounds of his independent wealth. A nice Jay Gatsby-like friend to have, and everything worked out fine for Gatsby, right? The expedition also brought along 2 Russian men, Dmitry Garov, the dog driver, and Anton Olmanchenko, the groom. Edward Wilson, the third man who had gone with Shackleton and Scott close to the South Pole on the Discovery expedition, was the chief scientist and headed a team of, quote, as impressive a group of scientists as had ever been on a polar expedition, unquote. He was also Scott's closest confidant on the trip. Zoologist Aspley Cherry Garrard, who we will get back to, had no official scientific training, but Wilson liked him, and he also gave them the modern-day equivalent of over 100,000 pounds, and they decided that was good enough. They also brought Norwegian skiing expert Trygve Gran. Scott actually raised much of the funds for the expedition himself. Scott and his team decided on a combination of motorized sleds with sails, which were a very new invention at the time, dog sledding, pony riding, and good old-fashioned walking for the Terra Nova trip. The team's dog expert and Russian translator, Cecil Mears, who we will also get back to, went to Siberia to select dogs and horses, although he didn't know much about the latter, and the ponies he chose were not well suited to the Arctic work. On June 15, 1910, the Terra Nova set sail. While they were traveling, Scott would receive a shocking telegram, which told him that he was not only facing a trip to the South Pole, but a race against the Norwegian team, led by Roald Amundsen. When reporters asked Scott about this, he stated that it did not affect his plans, and he would not give up their scientific goals to try and beat the Norwegians. He privately wrote in his diary that he knew the other team had a solid chance at beating them. The voyage to Antarctica was not smooth. A storm nearly sank the ship, and the men had to bail it out by hand. They lost 2 ponies, a dog, 10,000 kilograms of coal, and 3,000 liters of petrol. Then the ship got stuck in ice for 20 days. Then they dropped one of their motor sledges when they were unloading it, and it broke through the ice and sank. When they made land, they realized that the ponies actually slowed them down more than they helped. A group of Scotsmen went out to explore a section of Antarctica called the Victoria Land, and while there, they confirmed that the Norwegian and Amundsen team was camped 200 miles east of them, and the Norwegians were 69 miles closer to the pole. According to Cherry Garrod, Scott's party kind of wanted to go over and, quote, have it out with them, but wisely decided against it. Scott wrote in his diary, quote, one thing only fixes itself in my mind. The proper, as well as the wiser course, is for us to proceed exactly as though this had not happened, to go forward and do our best for the honor of our country without fear or panic, unquote. The men then began setting up supply depots along their planned route, and it also didn't go super great. They made slow progress. Lawrence Oates refused to use snowshoes on the horses for some reason. As the team moved to set up the most important supply area, the 1-ton depot, Scott realized that the ponies would not survive the trip unless they turned back. Oates insisted on moving forward and letting the ponies die, but Scott refused. Oates told Scott, "Sir, I'm afraid you'll come to regret not taking my advice." The depot was set up 30 miles farther away from the pole than where it was intended to go. 3 more of the ponies died after falling through ice on the way back, and Scott had to risk his own life to save a dog team that had fallen into a crevasse. But all the men returned. While they waited for the right conditions and prepared for the main journey, the team enjoyed games of football, European style. Atkinson was apparently the best player, according to Scott. Cherry Garrard restarted the magazine called the South Polar Times that Shackleton's team had produced on the Nimrod trip, and they also celebrated Scott's 43rd birthday and Midwinter Day. Several other exploratory teams journeyed out, including a scientific mission looking for emperor penguin eggs. Cherry Garrard, who went on the trip, described it as, quote, "the worst journey in the world," unquote, and Scott, who did not go on the trip, called it, quote, "a very wonderful performance," unquote. But now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for, the Great Southern March. The entire shore team set off towards the pole in November of 1911, with the motors, dogs, and horses. Scott wrote, quote, "I feel sure we are as near perfection as experience can direct," quote, and I wish I had his confidence. Slowly the group shrunk as support teams returned to base until there were 8 men left on January 4th, 1912. Scott chose the final 5-man team: himself, Dr. Edward Wilson, Lieutenant Henry Bowers, Captain Lawrence Oates, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans. The other 3 men returned to base. It was only intended to be a 4-man team, so the rations remained off for the remainder of the trip. The dog team, Mears and Dimitri, brought the message back to base camp that, quote, "things were not as rosy as they might be, but we keep our spirits up and say the luck must turn," unquote. I hate to say it, but the luck did not turn. January 17th was the day. The team finished their agonizing trek through the snow and reached their long-awaited destination, and Scott raised his eyes through the glaring fields of white, only to find a Norwegian flag waiting for them. Amundsen's team had beat them there by 5 weeks. Scott was absolutely crushed, and his excitement for the pole rapidly turned to anger and disgust. He recorded in his diary, quote, "the worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God! This is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority," unquote. Suddenly, the Antarctic plains that had seemed so full of promise now seemed like a terrible slog, much like all of our calendars for the year 2020. He wrote, "I'm afraid the return journey is going to be dreadfully tiring and monotonous," unquote. They had 862 miles to go back to base, and they set off on January 19th, still hoping to beat the Norwegians back to Australia, to send a telegram home with the news. By February 7th, they had made it the 300 miles across the polar plateau. Then they reached the 100-mile cliff face of Beardmore Glacier. Edgar Evans, a massive, powerful man, had been declining physically for weeks, and a fall on the ice had weakened him. He had a hand injury that wouldn't heal, terrible frostbite, and head injuries from several slips on the ice. Scott wrote, "He has absolutely changed from his normal self-reliant self," unquote. On February 17th, Evans had to be left alone while the rest of the team went to the supply depot, and when they returned for him, quote, "he was on his knees, clothing disarranged, hands uncovered and frostbitten, with a wild look in his eyes," unquote. Edgar Evans died that night near the glacier foot. On February 27th, they reached the spot where Atkinson had been instructed to meet them with the dog team. There were still 400 miles to go to get back to base. The dogs weren't there, but they were still 3 days early, so the team didn't panic. Scott wrote, "We are naturally always discussing possibility of meeting dogs, where and when, etc. It is a critical position. We may find ourselves in safety at the next depot, but there is a horrid element of doubt," unquote. But the dogs never came. The temperature dropped steeply, and the team was running out of fuel. The wind that they had hoped to push them along disappeared. Scott wrote that the ice, quote, "was coated with a thin layer of woolly crystals, formed by radiation, no doubt, These are too firmly fixed to be removed by the wind and cause impossible friction on the sledge runners." Unquote. Scott began to think he had miscalculated the meeting point for the dogs, and wrote, quote, "We very nearly came through, and it's a pity to have missed it. But lately I have felt that we have overshot our mark. No one is to blame, and I hope no attempt will be made to suggest we had lacked support." Unquote. Lawrence Oates was suffering from severe frostbite. He could barely walk alongside the sled, let alone help with the work. It was clear he was slowing the team down. On March 15th, he tried to convince them to leave him behind to die in his sleeping bag, but they refused. So he decided he would do the only thing he could think of to help his friends. When the team was sheltering in their tent from the -40-degree chill, on March 16th, Oates told his friends, quote, "I am just going outside, and maybe some time." Unquote. He walked out into the endless field of white, and Lawrence Titus Oates never returned. Scott later wrote of the experience, "We can testify to his bravery. He has borne intense suffering for weeks without complaint, and to the very last was able and willing to discuss outside subjects. He did not, would not, give up hope to the very end. He was a brave soul. This was the end. He slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning, yesterday. It was blowing a blizzard. He went out into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since." Unquote. Later, his comrades from his army unit would put up a memorial plaque for him at the church across from his house, and his mother, Caroline, polished it every week for the rest of her life. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, "What the hell, Atkinson? You had one job, and now you're that one guy in the group project team who didn't do his slides, and now the whole presentation is screwed up. Except in this case, the slides are saving your teammate from a literal icy grave. Where were you?" But there was someone else at fault, and his name was Cecil Mears. Mears had been explicitly instructed by Scott that he needed to meet them at One Ton Depot with the dog team, and if he couldn't do that, he needed to bring a man team instead. When Atkinson left Scott, Scott repeated these orders to him. But Mears returned to base camp and then promptly resigned. He had fought with Scott throughout the trip, including refusing to help rescue the dog team that had fallen into the crevasse. The exact reason he quit is unclear, but it was not the best timing. Now Atkinson was in charge of base camp, and when the ship came back, he used the shore party that was supposed to go meet Scott to unload the ship instead. Atkinson, Dmitry Gerov, and the dog team left late and were further delayed by bad weather. Then on the way, they ran into Lieutenant Evans, who was about to die of scurvy. The team turned around to bring Evans back to the safety of the ship, and he barely survived. Someone else had to go get Scott and his team. Wright was the most qualified as an expert navigator, but the chief scientist, Simpson, said that Wright had to stay to continue his research, which Evans would later say he thought Scott would have approved of. So Cherry Garrard and Dmitry Gerov set out. In Cherry Garrard's book, he originally claimed that Atkinson had given him unclear verbal orders to, quote, "decide what to do" if he reached One Ton Depot before Scott, and stated that it was not a rescue. However, Cherry Garrard later admitted that Scott had given a clear order to meet him no matter the circumstances, and both he and Atkinson had violated this order. Historian Karen May even goes further to suggest Atkinson had fabricated the excuse for not meeting Scott. No matter what conversations actually occurred, Cherry Garrard and Dmitry Gerov spent 6 days waiting for Scott's team at the One Ton Depot, claiming that their limited rations and the weather prevented them from going out further to look for the men. In summary, do I think a single orange could have saved this mission? Maybe, but I am neither a historian nor a doctor. The 3 remaining men, Wilson, Bowers, and Scott, made camp on March 19th after walking 20 more miles on frostbitten toes. Edward Wilson wrote a letter to a friend. Quote, "This looks like a finish to our undertaking, for we are out of food and oil, not able to move for 3 days now on account of the blizzard. We have had a long struggle against intense cold on very short fuel, and it has done us in. We shall make a forlorn effort to reach the next depot, but it means 22 miles, and none of us fit to face it. I want to say how I have valued your friendship. I have no fear of death, only sorrow for my wife and for my dear people. Otherwise, all is well. God's will be done." Unquote. They were only 12 miles away from the depot where the dogs were waiting, but a blizzard hit and kept them from finishing the journey. For 9 days they huddled inside as their supplies slowly dwindled, and Robert Scott began to write. Scribbled on paper scraps with frozen hands, he wrote a letter to Wilson and Bowers' mothers, his own mother, his wife, his former Navy commander, and several others. To the commander, he wrote in part, quote, "My dear Sir Francis, I fear we have shipped up. A close shave. I'm writing a few letters which I hope will be delivered some day. I want to thank you for the friendship you gave me of late years, and to tell you how extraordinarily pleasant I found it to serve under you. I want to tell you that I was not too old for this job. It was the younger men that went under first. I want you to secure a competence for my widow and boy. I leave them very ill provided for, but feel that the country ought not to neglect them. After all, we are setting a good example to our countrymen, if not by getting into a tight place, by facing it, like men, when we were there. We could have come through had we neglected the sick." Unquote. Concerned about his writing, Scott added, quote, "Excuse writing, it is -40°, unquote, which feels like a good enough excuse to me. He wrote to his wife, in part, "Dearest darling, we are in a very tight corner and I have doubts of pulling through. In our short lunch hours I take advantage of a very small measure of warmth to write letters preparatory to a possible end. The first is naturally to you, on whom my thoughts most dwell, while waking or sleeping. If anything happens to me, I shall like you to know how much you have meant to me, and that pleasant recollections are with me as I depart. I should like you to take what comfort you can from these facts also. I shall not have suffered any pain, but lead the world fresh from harness and full of good health and vigor. This is dictated already. When provisions come to an end, we simply stop where we are within easy distance of another depot. Therefore you must not imagine a great tragedy. We are very anxious, of course, and have been for weeks, but on splendid physical condition, and our appetites compensate for all discomfort. The cold is biting, and sometimes angering, but here again the hot food which drives it forth is so wonderfully enjoyable that we should scarcely be without it." Unquote. He also told her, "Since writing the above, we have got to within 11 miles of our depot with 1 hot meal, and 2 days' cold food, and we should have got through, but have been held for 4 days by a frightful storm." His last diary entry, likely on the day he died, was concluded, quote, "Last entry. For God's sake, look after our people." Scott was the last member of his group to die. Cherry Garrard and Dmitry Garov arrived back at base camp without Scott and his party. Atkinson set out with a search party as soon as the weather allowed, on March 26th. On March 30th they had to stop because of the weather, and Atkinson wrote that, quote, "In my own mind I was morally certain that the polar party had perished." Unquote. The men were forced back to base camp and continued their scientific work in quiet mourning until October 29th, when weather allowed them to leave again. They had a choice to make, to try and help a group of their men who were stuck at Cape Adare in the north of Antarctica, or to search for Scott. They decided on Scott, and they set out, although don't worry, the whole Adare team pulled through and rescued themselves while this team was gone. On November 12th, 1912, they found the polar team's frozen bodies. Trygve Gran, the skiing expert, later wrote that the tent was, quote, "snow-covered till up above the door, with Scott in the middle half out of his bag. The frost had made the skin yellow and transparent, and I've never seen anything worse in my life." Unquote. The group covered the bodies with the tent, and then with snow, and Gran used his skis to form a cross over their makeshift grave. Aspley Cherry Garrard, who would be haunted by his failed rescue attempt for the rest of his life, described the scene, quote, "We have found the bodies of Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, and all their records. Their death was, I am quite sure, not a painful one, for men get callous after a period of great hardship, but the long fight before must have been most terrible." Unquote. Atkinson read out parts of Scott's diary to understand how everything had unfolded. They also tried to find Oates' body, but only found his sleeping bag, and they set up another makeshift cross where they thought he had died. The rescue team also found several 35-pound Glossopteris tree fossils that Scott's group had dragged on hand sleds. They were the first ever fossils found in Antarctica, which helped prove the theory that the climate had once been warm there and the continents had once been connected. The rescuers also found a small case among Scott's things with a picture of his baby son, only 9 months old when he left, and a last treasured letter from Kathleen. She addressed it to Con, a shortening of his middle name, and it read in part, quote, "I love you more than is at all comfy, and moreover I think you are splendid. Now don't forget to brush your hair, and don't smoke so much, and altogether you're a ducky, darling, and hooray for you. How can I guess how things will be when you get this? But oh dearie, I am full of hope. My brave man will win. With his own right hand and with his mighty arm hath he gathered himself the victory. When you come home we'll feel closer and closer together, and the long time we've been apart will seem only a little hour. May all the good gods conspire to bring my Con through his great difficulties with a glad heart and a constant hope. Bless you, dearest of men. K." Unquote. Before the remaining members of the expedition left, the ship's carpenter created a large wooden memorial cross inscribed with the lost explorers' names, and a line from Alfred Tennyson's poem Ulysses that read, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." The Terra Nova reached New Zealand on February 10th, 1913, and broke the news about the death of Scott and the others. Britain was overtaken with honoring their legacy. The founder of the Boy Scouts Association, Robert Baden-Powell, stated, quote, "Are Britons going downhill? No, there is plenty of pluck and spirit left in the British after all. Captain Scott and Captain Oates have shown us that." A memorial service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral 4 days after the ship arrived. The survivors were given awards, honors, and promotions. It is likely that Scott would have been knighted if he returned alive, so his widow Kathleen was given the rank of a widow of a knight commander of the Order of the Bath. She remarried in 1922 politician and writer Edward Hilton Young, and she defended Scott's reputation until her death in 1947. Kathleen also sculpted a memorial statue of Scott that stands today in Christchurch, New Zealand. When news reached Scott's former rivals, Shackleton and Amundsen, they were shocked and horrified. The Times reported that they were, quote, "amazed to hear that such a disaster could overtake a well-organized expedition," unquote. Amundsen later stated, "I would gladly forego any honor or money if thereby I could have saved Scott his terrible death." There has been quite a bit of comparison between Scott's expedition and Amundsen's expedition. In fact, the comparison has its own Wikipedia page. God bless Wikipedia, the backbone of this podcast. Roald Amundsen's expedition made it to the pole first and returned home with all 19 of their men. 5 of Scott's 65 men died in Antarctica. One major difference is their methods of transportation. Amundsen's team relied almost exclusively on dogs, while Scott's team used a mix of dogs, ponies, and motorized sleds. Ponies are not well suited for snow and ice without using snowshoes, and as I mentioned before, Lawrence Oates didn't believe in using them. Ponies also had to start much later in the season than dogs, adding to the advantage Amundsen's team had in beating the British to the pole. Scott's team brought 19 ponies and only 10 made it to the main part of the journey. Dogs were also able to eat the food found in Antarctica, where the ponies' food had to be brought from home and lugged around by the men. The motor sledges were a unique idea, but Scott did not bring their engineer, Lieutenant Commander Reginald William Skelton, because Teddy Evans refused to have someone to a higher rank than him come along, which, Teddy, come on. Scott felt that the dogs they had taken on their first discovery expedition had failed, as they all eventually died, but experts now point out the problem to be that he and his men simply didn't use them properly. Scott ignored advice that he had received from experienced explorer Fridtjof Nansen to, quote, "bring dogs, dogs, and more dogs." Scott recognized that the dogs could be more effective than man-hauling hauling if they were pushed to their death. However, he did not want to use them this way, stating, quote, "One cannot calmly contemplate the murder of animals which possess such intelligence and individuality, which have frequently such endearing qualities, and which very possibly one has learnt to regard as friends and companions," unquote. Amundsen, on the other hand, planned for his weaker animals to be killed during the journey. He went to the Arctic with 52 dogs and came back with 11. The depot that Scott and his men were trying to reach on their return was intended to be farther out, which would have saved them. However, when they were setting it up, Scott made the kind-hearted but dangerous decision to reduce how far he drove the ponies, despite Oates' insistence on pushing them to the planned spot, which would have killed them. Historian Walter Sullivan summarized the transportation comparison as follows, quote, "Man is a poor beast of burden, as was shown in the terrible experience of Scott, Shackleton, and Wilson in their thrust to the south. However, Scott relied chiefly on man-hauling in 1911 and 12 because ponies could not ascend the glacier midway to the pole. The Norwegians correctly guessed that dog teams could go all the way. Furthermore, they used a simple plan based on their native skill with skis and on dog driving methods that were tried and true. The moon will be reached by burning up a succession of rocket stages and casting them off. This, in effect, is what the Norwegians did with their dogs, the weaker animals being sacrificed to feed the other animals and the men themselves." There has also been discussion on the difference in the rations between the two teams. You are what you eat, and Scott's team was eating trash. By the time his team reached the pole, they were in rough shape, while Amundsen's team had actually put on weight during the grueling trip. Cherry Garrard later estimated that Scott's rations only had half the calories required for the work that they were doing hauling the sleds themselves, and a 2006 recreation by the BBC confirmed this when their team had to stop because of severe weight loss. There was no vitamin B or C in their rations, and the team developed scurvy. The fuel they had brought leaked out of its canisters, which left them struggling to melt ice for drinking water. Amundsen had soldered his cans shut to prevent this problem. Strangely, one additional member of Scott's crew, Petty Officer Robert Falcon, died during a stop that the Terra Nova ship made in 1912 after the expedition. Falcon's body was found floating face down in shallow water near the wharf, with several wounds and a broken neck, although his death was attributed to drowning. A phonograph catalog was found on his body. Partying and drinking had been going on late into the night, but none of the Terra Nova crew members had participated in the festivities. It's been theorized that Falcon must have been unconscious when he hit the water, as otherwise the athletic man could have easily saved himself. Kathleen Scott was the one to break the news to Falcon's wife and 2 children, not yet knowing that she had lost her own husband. The mystery of Falcon's death would be overshadowed when news of the South Pole team's fate hit the news. Falcon's son, Ordinary Seaman R.T. Falcon, followed his father's footsteps and joined the Navy, and in 1924 he was given leave to visit his father's grave in the hills overlooking the French Pass. Despite his controversy, Robert Scott is remembered as a tragic hero. The 1948 film Scott of the Antarctic further solidified his reputation as a heroic explorer, although it did criticize him for his poor implementation of the ponies and motors. Biographers in the later decades of the 1900s criticized Scott further, with one even stating, "Scott doomed his companions, then covered his tracks with rhetoric." But more recent historians have repaired Scott's reputation. We now know that the weather conditions he faced were especially brutal, and Scott gave express written orders that the dogs come meet him, not just mentioned it casually. The British people took Scott's pleas in his diary entry to take care of their people and ran with it, raising £75,000, equivalent to £7,480,000 today, for the families of him and the other team members. Over 30 monuments and memorials were erected for Scott in Britain. Eventually, when a research station was built at the South Pole by the United States, it was jointly named for Amundsen and Scott. But the expedition was not a wash. The Terra Nova returned to England with over 2,100 plants, animals, and fossils, over 400 of which had never before been observed by science. The team also collected the longest stretch of continuous weather observation ever recorded at the time, which still today helps us understand the effects of climate change. In 1920, the Scott Polar Research Institute was founded by the Terra Nova expedition's geographer, Frank Debenham, and the geologist Raymond Priestley, which today is the largest collection of polar research. One of Robert Scott's last letters was to the public, to us. It did not place blame on any member of his team, but on the weather and the inherent dangers of the expedition. It read in part, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman."